Reverend Bob Tucker, and then I am going to read some excerpts that he sent me to read before he begins his talk that will help set the stage for his talk.
Okay, Margaret, it's time for us to record.
We welcome Reverend Bob Tucker. He's a native of Minnesota and has served in churches in South Dakota, Minnesota, Texas, and Kansas. He was the senior minister of the First Congregational Church of Houston for 28 years, and he's the executive director emeritus of the Foundation for Contemporary Theology. We really welcome Reverend Tucker again. He comes often and we enjoy his talks. Now I'm going to read these excerpts. Theology, the language of religion, has not received a very good press. Robert Heinlein, the late science fiction writer, wrote this vivid image. Theology is never any help. It is searching in a dark cellar at midnight for a black cat that isn't there. Theologians can persuade themselves of anything. H.L. Mencken, often regarded as one of the most influential American writers of the early 20th century, said, "Theology is the effort to explain the unknowable in terms of the not worth knowing." Rumi, a 13th century Persian poet living in what is today's modern Turkey, wrote the following about theology. Those who don't feel this love pulling them like a river, those who don't drink dawn like a cup of spring water, or take sunset like supper, those who don't want to change, let them sleep. This love is beyond the study of theology, that old trickery and hypocrisy. If you want to improve your mind that way, sleep on. I've given up on my brain. I've torn the cloth to shreds and thrown it away. If you're not completely naked, wrap your beautiful robe of words around you and sleep. And now, Reverend Tucker.
You may want to use the speaker view. Bob, something's muted. I'm sorry, you'll have to find that and then begin again.
Okay, is it okay now?
There you go.
Okay. Well, these quotes on theology that Judy just read make a positive talk on theology an uphill effort. But they do offer a straightforward statement of the general attitude toward theology. Well, today I'm going to describe contemporary theology and to make it, if at all possible, tantalizing. I suspect that every human activity has its own special vocabulary. And if one is going to be a practitioner, one has to learn the language. Lawyers speak of felony and misdemeanor, weavers of warp and weft, librarians deal in classification and cataloging. And in each area over time, words are added and lost and concepts change. Well, religion too has its language, theology, and it is new ways of understanding and using that language that I'm talking about today. A problem we have with specialized language is that we tend to get stuck in what we learned earlier in our lives and miss or even resist changes that occur later. Let me use an example in science. In school, we learned that the simplest simplest view of the atom was a central proton and and electron on the outside. And this particular schematic is before us very quite often. However, recently, we have a picture of a hydrogen atom that actually looks quite different. And it's developed by a quantum microscope that has been discovered, or that was developed in the Netherlands. The one hydrogen electron makes up the outer ring. Seeing this picture means we can no longer realistically think of or even view an atom with a static electron hanging motionless on the page. Actually, even this picture is incomplete in that it is two-dimensional. It is better to think of the shape of an atom representing a dandelion going to seed. In so many fields of human activity, we are locked into viewing things, and one of them is religion. Like the new verse of the atom, like the new view of the atom, theologians have formulated a number of new ways of putting together beliefs. The old story of three bricklayers is a parable on this. The Great Fire of 1666 that leveled London, Britain's most famous architect, Christopher Wren, was commissioned to rebuild St. Paul's Cathedral. The story is that one day in 1671, Christopher Wren spoke to three bricklayers in the scaffold. And to the first bricklayer, Christopher Wren asked the question, "What are you working on?" And the bricklayer replied, "I'm a bricklayer. I'm working hard to lay bricks to feed my family." And the second bricklayer responded, "I'm a builder, building a wall." And the third bricklayer was asked the question, "What are you doing?" and replied, "I'm a cathedral builder." Well, theology is the way we put the whole enterprise of our life together, taking the disparate elements and putting them into a larger perspective. And what I'm going to do is to take a quick tour of contemporary theologians. And I hope that whatever dead theologians reside, wherever they reside these days, they will be in an eye-rolling but forgiving mood as I trim and reduce their extensive and nuanced writings. The first theologian that I want to mention is Rudolf Bultmann, who died in 1976. I've mentioned Bultmann previously, but not by name. His theology is associated with a title called Demythologizing. Again, myth needs to be understood as story and not fanciful fable. What Bultmann wrote was that we turn deep understandings and convictions into stories, and then we too often make the stories literal. And we need to unpack the truth embedded in the story, that is, demythologize. For example, people who are very self-centered, seldom considering others, the Greeks put that belief into a story, the story of Narcissus, who was so beautiful that when he saw himself reflected in a pool of still water, not realizing it was himself, he so fell in love that he forgot about everything else, including eating, and eventually wasted away to death. Now, we don't disparage the Greeks by saying how dumb could they be to believe the tale of Narcissus. They didn't. It was a story, but it was a story that told a factual truth. A modern example of what Bultmann was talking about is the expression, "he sounds like a broken record." At our age, we immediately know what that means. But to use that expression with the average high school student today is puzzling nonsense. What Bultmann's demythologizing allows one to do is to trash the old, outworn beliefs that reside in one's mind and to free oneself. And by the way, demythologizing is not limited to religion. There are parts of American history that need demythologizing as well. And it's happening. For example, we now know that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson was the owner of slaves. That needs to be kept in mind as we put together the story of America. So Bultmann allows us to clear out past trash. However, there are newer theologians that give us a path forward. And the second theologian I want to mention is Paul Tillich. He died in 1965. Tillich was regarded as one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century. As a young ordained minister, he was sent as a military chaplain to German soldiers in World War I. That was a shattering experience for him, not only for its carnage and its physical destruction, but as evidence of the bankruptcy of all the ideals of 19th century humanism. His world crashed down. But what came out of that experience was the tossing of the traditional monotheistic idea of God as a being alongside the world with the definable properties. He regarded this replacement as vital for establishing a believable theology. He said that God is found not out there, but in the depths of our lives, where the profundities swirl around. Tillich said that God is being itself, the depth and power of being. And he produced a book that was titled The Shaking of the Foundations, and indeed his thinking was just that. Tillich's passionate concern for freedom made him an early critic of Hitler and the Nazi movement. And in retaliation, he was barred from German universities in 1933. As he wryly put it, the first non-Jewish academician to be so honored. He then accepted an invitation to join the faculty at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And for centuries, the abode of God was in the heavens, in the sky. And so we looked up, lifting our eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh our help, as the psalmist put it. But Tillich, because of his war experience, said that God is not in the sky, but in the very depth of human experience. And he helps our steps carry us in new directions. The next theologian, the third one I want to mention, is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He died in 1945. What his famous phrase is that Jesus is God's man for others. Bonhoeffer was also a Lutheran minister, theologian, an anti-Nazi dissident, a key founding member of the Confessing Church in Germany. His writings on Christianity's role in the secular world have become widely influential, and his book, The Cost of Discipleship, has been described as a modern classic. Apart from his theological writings, Bonhoeffer was known for his staunch resistance to the Nazi dictatorship, including vocal opposition to Hitler's euthanasia program and his persecution and killing of the Jews. He was a determined opponent of the regime from its first days. In fact, when Hitler was installed as chancellor, Bonhoeffer delivered a radio address in which he attacked Hitler, and he was cut off in the middle of the air, in the middle of a sentence. In 1933, Bonhoeffer raised the first voice for church resistance to Hitler's persecution of Jews, declaring that the church must not simply bandage the victims under the world, but jam a spoke in the wheel itself. He was arrested in April of 1943 by the Gestapo and imprisoned because he was accused of being associated with a plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. And he was hanged in April of 1945 as the Nazi regime was collapsing, just 2 weeks before it did. He was hanged on direct orders of Hitler. It was very difficult for Bonhoeffer because he belonged to a tradition that gave obedience to authority. And here he is fighting against authority. He came to this country in 1939 at the invitation of Union Theological Seminary in New York City. But after much inner turmoil, he soon regretted his decision and returned to Germany 2 weeks later, saying that he could not be separate from his country if he was at all going to be part of the rebuilding process after Hitler was gone. He's had a great influence in the kind of activity that religious people have gotten into in social affairs. And his influence went as far as Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement in this country.
Hello. Hello. Thank you. How are you since yesterday? Pretty fine. That's good. Pretty fine is good.
Maggie, you need to mute yourself.
Okay. Well, anyway, he became an inspiration for Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights movement in this country, and also the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. Overshadowed by the dramatic events of his life, Bonhoeffer's theology, nevertheless, has been greatly influential. He raised some very tantalizing questions about the role of Christianity and the church in a world come of age, where human beings no longer needed a metaphysical God as a stopgap to human limitations, and mused about the emergence of a religionless Christianity, where God would be unclouded from metaphysical constructs of the past 1900 years. And so you can see that he also had this new vision of something changing in the way human beings viewed religion and viewed God. And he also put forth the idea that Bonhoeffer's God is a suffering God, and in Jesus, he is God's man for others. The next theologian I want to mention is Henry Nelson Wyman. If you've had enough German theologians now, and by the way, at least Christian theology in the 19th century was almost fully German. But in this next theologian, finally we shift to the United States and we shift to a Unitarian Universalist, Henry Nelson Wyman. He's known what is called religious naturalism. Religious naturalism is exemplified at the University of Chicago. And I mentioned that school because that's where I attended. And also when I was there, I felt the influence of Wyman. At the end of his life, Wyman and his wife were members of the Grinnell, Iowa Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. And in a 1967 sermon to the Unitarians, he said, "I don't think I've found any other association of people who gather regularly to consider the important problems of human existence, which I found is more congenial, or as congenial as this. And 6 days after his death, Wyman was awarded the Unitarian Universalist Association Award for distinguished service to the cause of liberal religion. Well, it's quite obvious that naturalism is the belief that nature is all that exists, and that all things supernatural, including God, spirit, souls, and non-natural values, do not exist. A naturalist takes nature to heart and rejects the notion of a supernatural realm. And yet, this policy, this idea that he put forth was not just naturalism, but religious naturalism. And what he considered there was that not only are human beings part of nature, but the products of human are also part of the natural world. The great buildings that they put up, the music that they write, the ideas that they put forth. And so the best way to understand the world and to be a religious person is to be a religious naturalist. These new naturalistic explanations of religious belief suppose that religion is part of our nature as human beings, as suppose something culturally constructed. It might serve a biological function, or it might be a mere byproduct of our cognition. But nevertheless, the tendency to form religious belief is a universal reality. And so along with naturalism, or a part of naturalism, better to say it that way, is the religious naturalism of Wyman. Well, the last theologian that I want to mention is Charles Hartzhorn. He died in the year 2000. And he developed what was called process theology. With the advent of World War I, he became a hospital orderly in Normandy. And like many other participants in the war, the enormous toll in human lives and injury deeply upset him. One distinction process theologians make is between the idea of unilateral power versus relational power. And this whole idea of a relational divinity, or a relational universe in which we live, is something that came out of process theology, but is widely spread in religious talk today. Unilateral power is the power of a king or a tyrant who wishes to exert control over its subjects without being affected by them. However, most people would agree that a ruler who is not changed or affected by the joys and sorrows of his subject is actually a despicable ruler and a psychopath. Well, I think we see indications of some of that disconnect with our national leaders. Process theologians thus stress that God's power is relational rather than being unaffected and unchanged by the word. God being most affected by every other being in the universe. And of course, process theologians, even though they don't believe in the literal God that so often comes to my mind, they still use the word as the way of talking about that which is truly important, truly central to human life. One process theologian tried to describe it this way. It said, this relational idea requires a willingness to endure tremendous suffering while refusing to hate. It demands that we keep our hearts open to those who wish to slam them shut. It means offering to open up a relationship with people who hate us, despise us, and wish to destroy us. Well, I don't know whether we experience God or the universe that way, but anyway, that's the message of process theology. There's one other aspect of process theology that I find quite fascinating, and it has a closeness to quantum mechanics. Send a photon to a receptor, and you don't know whether it's a particle or wave, and you will not know until it actually happens, until it is there. The closest one can come to figuring out what a photon is going to be is to make a statistical statement. So process theology sees humans also living and deciding in each moment. To be sure, there is a past and there is a future, but the moment exists in itself. So that what happens is that as we enter into each moment, we make a decision on what that moment is going to be. And then in the next moment, we are making that decision again. Let me give a metaphor here that maybe will help. Before the digital age, movie makers shot movies on film, and a film comprises single images moved rapidly through a projector's light beam. Although images were static, each passed across the light, giving the impression of movement on screen. And so movie buffs early on called this phenomenon moving pictures. Open and relational thinkers think life and living creatures are a series of moments whose flow comprise existence. Time's flow is fundamental, but like images moving across the projector's beam, so the moments of God's life and ours comprise the story of reality. The film and projector analogy breaks down in one way, however. The films we watch have been recorded, edited, and produced. The film director and producer pre-decided how the story is going to be told. By contrast, open and relational thinkers believe each moment is created in that moment. So the next frame is now in the making, right now, and now, and now, and now. That is, at each moment, this talk, you have made a decision on whether to listen, daydream, think of a task you need to do this afternoon, and so forth. And what relational theology says that we need to take responsibility for our lives, moment by moment, as we make those decisions. Jewish and Buddhist thinkers also have made use of process theology, operating with quite different scriptures and traditions. What process theology says is that there's no longer a dead hand of the past. We have a past, but how that past is dealt with moment by moment is up to us. Each moment is open to a new decision, to new creativity. Well, this is some of the theologians that have existed in the latter part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. And they have significantly changed the way theologians begin to look at life and belief. It's easy for us to hold on to the past, to the religion that we learned when we were young, to the theology that was taught back then. But like the atom, a change needs to take place, they say, and have opened up windows in ways that, at least when I was young, I never believed possible. So let me just go through and review some of these. There's Rudolf Bultmann, who demythologized, and he helps us to clear out of our minds the trash of the past. There's Paul Tillich, who speaks of God not as out there, but God is in the depths where the deep feelings that we have about life and the world are swirling around. Dietrich Bonhoeffer gave us a model for the God for others as being deeply involved in the world around. And his deep involvement in anti-Nazism and journey caused him his own death. He also spoke of a religionless Christianity, and that would be could be expanded to any religion, moving away from the formal structures. We have Henry Nelson Wyman, who spoke of religious naturalism, a theology that I find quite compatible. It's natural. There is only the world that we have. That's all there is. There ain't no moreism, as one person put it. But religion is also part of the natural world of which humans are a part. And then there's Charles Hartzhorn, who was a leader in the whole process theology. And that's the most recent theological development that's taken place, at least a significant one. And it begins not only to speak that we live in a relational world, but that we are responsible as individuals for the kind of moment-by-moment decisions that we make. Let me add something else at the end here. I wasn't planning on saying this, but one thing that strikes me about all these theologians is how war affected each one. The First World War and the Second. And I think it was the sheer destruction of physical life and the tremendous turmoil that people went through that caused them to shake loose of old theological ideas. Well, theology is not on the front of today's society, and the quotes that I put together at the beginning of this talk, certainly will still resonate well in people. And ministers, if you listen to sermons, and I tend to listen to a lot of sermons, are still stuck in the past theologies. But if you want a framework for religious expression, for a way of pulling your life together and living into the future, you have now before you 5 theologians. Thank you for your attention.